My name is Naomi. I am 28 years old, and 10 years ago, I left my family with just a $10 bill in my pocket, one backpack, and a teaching scholarship they falsely accused me of stealing. My father told our entire church congregation that I was mentally unstable. I built a new life from absolutely nothing. But last month, my golden child sister stumbled across my name online. The first call came from her. Then my mother called. Then my grandmother. Within 24 hours, I had 69 missed calls, and every single one of them wanted to tell me the exact same thing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your true worth. The notification light on my private burner phone flashed relentlessly across the polished oak of my desk. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, gazing out at the glittering skyline. The city below was moving fast, but inside my office, time felt strangely suspended. I was in the middle of finalizing a $50 million corporate buyout for my venture capital firm, Blackstone Credit. It was a massive deal, the kind that required total focus and ruthless precision. Yet my attention kept drifting back to that cheap plastic phone vibrating on the table. It was a secondary number one I had kept active for a decade, strictly out of morbid curiosity, tied only to the ghosts of my past. I picked it up and stared at the screen. 69 missed calls. All from Atlanta. All from the people who had erased me from their lives. I pressed play on the most recent voicemail. The voice that filled my silent office belonged to my mother, Vivica. It was a tone I recognized instantly, dripping with that weaponized, sugary sweetness she reserved for the ladies at her Sunday service. "Naomi, sweetheart," she began, her voice practically vibrating with false warmth. "We know you have been hiding in shame for 10 years after stealing the scholarship of your sister Simone, but the Lord teaches forgiveness. Our family real estate firm is hosting a massive anniversary gala this weekend. We decided it is time to bring you back into the fold. Come home. We forgive you." I listened to the message twice. I did not feel a single tear prick my eyes. The old Naomi, the scared 18-year-old girl desperate for the love of a mother, might have broken down, sobbing, but that girl died a long time ago. Instead of crying, I turned my gaze to a small custom glass frame sitting proudly next to my computer monitor. Inside the frame was a crumpled, faded $10 bill. It was essentially my most prized possession. Staring at that old green face, the memories washed over me with crystal clear intensity. The narrative seamlessly shifted back 10 years to a crowded sanctuary in Atlanta. I could still smell the heavy perfume of the church elders and hear the hushed whispers of the congregation. My father, Winston, a respected elder and prominent businessman in our African American community, stood at the pulpit. He was shaking his head, performing his role of the heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. He announced to hundreds of people that his youngest daughter had maliciously plagiarized the college admission essay of her older sister out of pure spite and jealousy. It was a complete fabrication. Simone, the beautiful, popular golden child, had actually failed her entrance exams and stolen my hard work to secure her own future. But my parents needed to protect their flawless family image. The concept of Black excellence was everything to Winston and Vivica. A scandalous failure from their favorite daughter was simply unacceptable, so I became the sacrificial lamb. Winston called me to the front of the church, declaring me mentally unstable and spiritually lost. He handed me a single $10 bill in front of everyone, telling me it was the last piece of support I would ever receive from the family name. They threw me out into the street with nothing but a backpack and that single bill, sacrificing my entire future just to maintain their pristine social standing. I kept that $10 bill as a reminder. It reminded me to never rely on anyone but myself. It fueled every late-night study session, every brutal corporate negotiation, and every calculated investment that led me to the top of the venture capital world. My phone buzzed again, snapping me out of the past and back into my luxurious penthouse. This time it was a text message. The sender was Julian, my brother-in-law. Julian was married to Simone and was widely regarded by my parents as a financial genius. He was a smooth-talking executive who always wore designer suits and drove imported cars. The text read, "Hey Naomi, Simone has been crying all night because she misses her little sister so much. We want you at the gala. I already bought you a first-class ticket to Atlanta for tomorrow morning. Please do not be ungrateful, just come home and make things right." I read the text and let out a short, sharp laugh. Simone crying over me was the most ridiculous concept I had ever heard. Simone only cried when a boutique ran out of her shoe size. And Julian spending money on a first-class ticket for a sister-in-law he actively despised was even more suspicious. The sudden, overwhelming desire to reconnect after 10 years of absolute silence was not born out of familial love. It was a calculated move. They needed something. They had stumbled across my name. Perhaps they saw a profile on a financial blog, or maybe they noticed my company, Blackstone Credit, making waves in the commercial real estate sector. Whatever the reason, their phantom olive branch was dripping with poison. I did not block their numbers. I did not reply to the text. Instead, I walked over to my desk. I pressed the intercom button to connect directly with my executive intelligence team. My lead analyst picked up immediately. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice cool and commanding, "I need a full, unrestricted financial diagnostic run immediately. Focus on a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta owned by Winston Hayes. I also need a deep dive into the personal bank accounts, offshore holdings, and credit histories of Julian Vance. I want everything you can find within the next 4 hours. Look for outstanding debts, pending foreclosures, and any unusual cash flow activities." Marcus did not ask questions. He simply confirmed the order and went to work. I ended the call and walked back to the windows, looking down at the city lights beginning to flicker to life. The puzzle pieces were already snapping into place in my mind. Winston and Vivica did not miss their estranged daughter. Simone was not losing sleep over the sister she had ruthlessly betrayed. Julian was not spending thousands of dollars out of the goodness of his heart. They were going bankrupt. The realization settled over me with a heavy, satisfying finality. For a decade, they had operated under the assumption that they were untouchable royalty within their community, parading around in their luxury vehicles, while I struggled to survive. They thought throwing me away would secure their perfect lives forever. Now the walls of their carefully constructed empire were clearly crumbling. They needed a lifeline, and somehow they had figured out that the ugly college dropout they had discarded was now sitting on a mountain of capital. They thought they could reel me back in with sweet words and religious guilt trips. They expected me to be the same desperate girl who would do anything for a scrap of validation. They were gravely mistaken. I picked up my phone and finally typed out a response to the message. I kept it brief, polite, and completely devoid of emotion. "Thank you for the ticket. I will see you at the gala." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the leather sofa. I walked back to my desk, my eyes locking onto the framed $10 bill once more. The upcoming weekend was not going to be a heartfelt family reunion. It was going to be a reckoning. I had spent 10 years sharpening my skills in the most cutthroat corporate environments on earth. I knew how to dismantle a failing enterprise piece by piece, and I knew how to expose fraudulent assets. They wanted me to come home. They wanted me to step back into their world. I smiled to myself, feeling a cold anticipation. I was definitely going back to Atlanta. I was ready to show them that the girl they threw away was now the woman holding their ultimate fate in her bare hands. I landed at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport on a private charter, but I deliberately walked past the private aviation terminal. Julian had sent a confirmation for a commercial first-class ticket, which I had promptly canceled the night before. Taking a standard ride-share to the Piedmont Country Club, I reviewed my strategy. The venue was a predictable choice for Winston. It was exclusive, drenched in old Southern money, and required an expensive membership that my father paraded like a badge of honor. The circular driveway was lined with imported European luxury sedans and immaculate landscaping. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for members who wore their wealth like heavy armor. The oppressive Georgia heat radiated off the pristine cobblestones, but I barely felt it. I was far too focused on the execution of my plan. I stepped out of the car wearing a simple beige cashmere sweater and unbranded tailored trousers. To the untrained eye, I looked like a struggling administrative assistant trying to dress appropriately for a rare lunch outing. To those who understood stealth wealth, my outfit was worth more than Julian's car. I checked my reflection in the dark tinted glass of the club's grand entrance, ensuring not a single logo or flashy accessory betrayed my massive net worth. I wanted them to see exactly what they expected to see: a broken, defeated woman crawling back to the safety of her family. The maitre d' led me to the private dining terrace overlooking the pristine 18th hole. They were already seated. Winston wore a sharply pressed navy suit. Vivica was draped in a loud, floral designer dress that screamed for attention. Simone sat next to her husband Julian, adjusting her posture the moment she spotted me. Julian checked his gold watch, looking annoyed. I walked toward the table, maintaining a completely neutral expression. Winston did not even stand to greet me. He simply gestured to the empty chair at the far end of the table opposite him. Vivica offered a tight, practiced smile that failed to reach her eyes. She leaned back, assessing my plain sweater with obvious distaste. "Naomi," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, patronizing lilt. "We honestly were not sure you would actually show up. It has been a very long time." I sat down, placing my leather clutch on the empty chair beside me. "10 years, mother," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Winston cleared his throat, signaling his impatience. He signaled a waiter and ordered a round of expensive appetizers without bothering to ask if I had any preferences. He demanded the Wagyu beef tartare and the imported truffle burrata, acting as if spending exorbitant amounts of money would somehow intimidate me into submission. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to make me feel small and financially inadequate in the presence of his supposed power. Julian finally looked up from his phone, flashing a bright, artificial grin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp, white tablecloth. "We are glad you made it, Naomi. I hope the flight I booked was comfortable. First class is a nice treat, is it not?" I looked directly at Julian. "The flight was fine," I said, choosing not to reveal that I never set foot on his commercial flight. Simone chuckled, a high, thin sound that grated on my nerves. She placed her left hand prominently on the table, ensuring the sunlight caught the massive diamond ring on her finger. "It is good for you to get out of the city, Naomi. Living in a tiny apartment all these years must be so exhausting. We always pray for your stability." They were treating me like a charity case, an errant sheep returning to the flock. The absolute arrogance was almost impressive. The conversation quickly shifted into a theatrical display of their supposed prosperity. Vivica spent the next 20 minutes loudly name-dropping every prominent figure in Atlanta. She made sure the tables nearby could hear her discussing her recent brunch with the mayor's wife and her upcoming leadership role in the church's annual fundraising committee. "We are expanding the real estate portfolio rapidly," Vivica boasted, taking a delicate sip of her mimosa. "Winston is receiving the Community Pillar Award this weekend. It is quite an honor, but of course they recognize true leadership." Simone nodded enthusiastically, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Julian has been securing incredible investment deals for the firm. We are actually looking at buying a vacation home in Hilton Head next month. God has blessed us tremendously." The entire display was carefully choreographed to highlight their success and emphasize my supposed failure. They were projecting an image of untouchable Black excellence, a perfect, flawless family unit. I watched them perform, mentally comparing their boasts to the devastating financial dossiers my executive team had compiled the night before. I knew Julian was draining their accounts to pay off illegal gambling debts. I knew Winston was days away from catastrophic default. Yet here they sat, eating caviar and pretending to rule the world. The waiter arrived with my sparkling water. I took a slow sip, waiting for the inevitable pivot. The small talk was merely the appetizer. They had not called me here to boast. They called me here because they were drowning. Winston wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and pushed his plate aside. The superficial warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, calculating demeanor of a desperate businessman. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor beside him and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed the folder onto the center of the table with a heavy thud. He skipped any pretense of a genuine apology for the past decade. "Naomi, We are a family of faith. Winston began, his voice dropping an octave to convey authority. We believe in second chances and redemption. You made terrible mistakes in the past. You brought immense shame to this family when you tried to sabotage your sister. I felt a familiar flash of anger at the lie, but I kept my face entirely impassive. Winston tapped the folder with his index finger. But the Lord commands us to forgive. I am giving you an opportunity to redeem yourself, to earn your way back into this family's good graces. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. And how exactly do I earn this redemption, Winston? Julian took over, sliding the documents closer to me. The firm is bridging a massive expansion project. We have the capital, but our liquid assets are temporarily tied up in escrow. We need a secondary guarantor for a short-term bridge loan. It is merely a formality to satisfy the underwriters. I glanced at the top page. It was an $800,000 commercial loan agreement with a predatory interest rate. They needed a clean credit profile to secure the funds. They assumed my decade of living off the grid meant I had zero debt and a pristine credit score. It is your spiritual duty, Naomi Vivica added, her voice sharp and commanding. We are offering you a way to cleanse your past sins. Sign the guarantor line. Julian will manage the payments. You will not have to do a single thing except put your name on the paper. It is the absolute least you can do after everything we have provided for you in this life. Simone leaned across the table, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. Think of it as an apology, Naomi. You sign this, and we can finally be a real family again. I looked at the loan documents, then at the four expectant faces watching me. They honestly believed their emotional extortion would work. They thought religious guilt and the promise of their toxic affection would force my hand. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on the thick stack of papers. Slowly and deliberately, I pushed the folder back across the table until it hit Winston's water glass. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice steady and perfectly calm. The absolute shock on their faces was instantaneous. I raised my hand and flagged down the passing waiter. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, placing it on the table to cover my single glass of sparkling water. Keep the change, I told the waiter. I picked up my clutch and stood up, pushing my chair back. The plush atmosphere of the country club terrace suddenly felt incredibly suffocating. I looked down at Winston, whose face was rapidly turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Have a wonderful lunch, I said. They had orchestrated this entire brunch assuming I was desperate for their validation. They were entirely wrong. I had outgrown their need for control a long time ago. I turned on my heel and walked away from the table, leaving them stranded in their own manufactured illusion of superiority and control. I took exactly 3 steps away from the table before the heavy thud of a fist slamming against solid oak echoed across the terrace. The sound was violently loud, slicing right through the gentle clinking of crystal and the soft hum of country club chatter. I paused but did not immediately turn around. Get back here right now, Winston bellowed. His voice was a guttural roar that completely shattered the refined atmosphere of the Piedmont Country Club. The wealthy patrons seated at nearby tables gasped and turned their heads in absolute shock. The polished, respectable patriarch persona vanished almost instantly. Winston Hayes had spent decades meticulously crafting his public image. He was no longer the benevolent church elder or the smooth-talking real estate mogul. He was just a desperate, furious man losing control of his carefully arranged board. I slowly turned to face him. Winston was standing right on his feet. His chair had tipped over backwards and hit the stone floor with a loud clatter. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging and his face had turned a deep shade of crimson. Vivica was pulling at his expensive suit jacket, frantically hissing at him to sit down. Julian was frozen in his seat, his eyes wide with genuine panic as he looked around at the wealthy investors and local politicians who were now staring directly at our table. You do not get to walk away from me, Winston snarled, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. You do not get to come down here and disrespect this family after everything we have endured because of your selfish behavior. You owe us your absolute obedience, Naomi. You owe us your signature on those documents right now, I stood completely still, keeping my hands relaxed down at my sides. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I do not owe you a single thing, I said calmly. Your financial mismanagement is not my responsibility. If your commercial real estate company is failing, then you should probably ask your brilliant chief financial officer to fix the problem. I glanced briefly at Julian, who immediately looked down at his expensive leather shoes, unable to meet my direct gaze. Winston slammed his hand on the table a second time, causing the expensive silverware to rattle violently against the fine white china plates and drinking water glasses. Do not talk to Julian like that, Winston shouted loudly. Julian is the only reason this firm is surviving. He is 10 times the professional you will ever be. You are nothing but a stubborn, ungrateful child playing dress-up. You think you can waltz back into our lives and act superior because you live in some tiny apartment in New York. You are exactly the same arrogant little girl who tried to ruin her sister 10 years ago. You have not changed at all. The absolute hypocrisy of his angry words washed over me, but I remained entirely stoic. Winston stepped out from behind the table, closing the physical distance between us. His chest was heaving with immense, righteous indignation. If you walk out that door without signing these loan papers, I will destroy you. He threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious sneer. I will do exactly what I did to you 10 years ago. I will call Pastor Thomas right now. I will call the city council. I will make sure every single person in Atlanta knows exactly what kind of person you really are. You will never be able to show your disgraced face anywhere again. I will stand up in front of the entire congregation this Sunday and remind them of your sins. Winston continued, breathing heavily. I will make sure everyone in Atlanta knows you are a thief and a degenerate. I will tell them you came back just to extort your own family. I will ruin your professional reputation. I will call every employer in your industry and tell them you are a verified fraud. You will be a pariah in this city, Naomi. You will be a pariah in this entire state. You will have absolutely nothing and absolutely nobody left ever. He was panting now, completely unhinged by the realization that his intimidation tactics were bouncing harmlessly off my strong armor. He expected me to crumble to beg for his mercy, or to start crying hysterically like I did when I was a helpless teenager. Instead, I just tilted my head slightly, observing his temper tantrum with detached clinical interest. It was truly pathetic to watch a grown man resort to playground threats simply because he could not force his daughter to co-sign a fraudulent loan. Simone sensed that her father was losing momentum and quickly jumped into the fray. Simone stood up, smoothing down her designer dress with trembling hands. Her eyes were flashing with toxic malice. You are just bitter, Naomi. Simone sneered, her voice dripping with pure venom. You are angry because you have absolutely nothing to show for your pathetic life. Look at you. You are approaching 30, and you are completely alone. You do not have a husband. You do not have any children. You do not have a proper home. You are just an angry, lonely spinster who wants to punish us because we have everything you could never ever truly manage to achieve. Simone stepped closer, standing right next to our furious father. You are so jealous of me, it is honestly embarrassing. Simone continued, crossing her arms over her chest. I am a respectable wife. I have real social standing in this community. People look up to me and Julian. We represent true success and traditional values. What do you represent, Naomi? A sad, empty existence in a cold city. You lack social standing. You lack basic respectability. No decent man would ever want to marry a woman who betrays her own flesh and blood just out of pure, evil, malicious spite. Vivica finally found her voice chiming in from her seat. Listen to your sister Naomi. She speaks the honest truth. A woman without a family is a woman without a purpose. We are giving you a golden opportunity to be useful. If you just sign the papers, we will help you find a nice church-going man. We will fix your terrible reputation. We will welcome you back to the dinner table. Do not throw your only chance at happiness away simply because you are too stubborn to admit you were wrong. Just be a good, dutiful daughter right now. The barrage of psychological warfare was relentless. They were attacking my character, my relationship status, and my fundamental worth as a human being. They were desperately utilizing every toxic manipulation tactic they had perfected over the last 3 decades. 10 years ago, these cruel insults would have utterly devastated me. They would have shattered my self-esteem and sent me spiraling into a deep depression. But today, their desperate words felt incredibly hollow. They were just meaningless noises coming from weak, terrified people who were drowning in a vast ocean of their own terrible financial decisions and desperate, wicked lies. I looked at Simone, observing the genuine fear hiding beneath her arrogant sneer. She was terrified of losing her luxury cars, her country club membership, and her superficial social status. She was entirely dependent on Julian and his stolen money to fund her illusion of superiority. I looked at Winston, seeing a desperate fraud who was willing to sacrifice his own child to save his failing business. I looked at Vivica, recognizing a shallow enabler who cared more about appearances than the actual truth. They were a pathetic trio, united only by their shared greed and overwhelming fear of poverty. The absolute silence stretched heavily between us. The surrounding country club patrons were completely quiet, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. Winston stood there, waiting for my response, expecting his threats to finally bring me to my knees. Simone smirked, believing her cruel words had struck a fatal blow to my confidence. Vivica held her breath, hoping her false promises of maternal affection would close the deal. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not bother to list my massive corporate achievements or reveal my billionaire financial status just yet. I looked directly at my father with dead, cold eyes. My expression was completely void of any emotion or residual familial attachment. I let the silence hang in the humid air for 5 agonizing seconds, ensuring they felt the full weight of my absolute indifference. "Do your worst, Winston," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet whisper. I turned my back on them and walked away. I strode confidently across the terrace, my head held high completely, ignoring the enraged shouting echoing behind me. I walked out, leaving them entirely stranded, panicked, and facing total financial ruin alone. The heavy glass doors of the country club swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my father shouting. I walked to the waiting car, sliding into the cool leather interior with practiced grace. As the vehicle pulled away from the manicured lawns, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a cold, stark clarity in its wake. I knew exactly what was coming next. Winston Hayes was a creature of absolute predictability. When cornered, he always resorted to scorched earth tactics. The smear campaign began before my car even reached the airport. My burner phone buzzed with the first notification. By the time I boarded my private jet back to Manhattan, the isolated ping of a single message had transformed into a relentless digital avalanche. Winston had unleashed his extensive network of church elders and influential community leaders. My secondary email inbox was entirely flooded with dozens of messages from people I had not spoken to in a decade. Pastor Thomas sent a lengthy sermon disguised as an email praying fervently for my deeply troubled soul. He urged me to cast aside my selfish pride and return to the truly loving embrace of my supposedly righteous and deeply wounded family. The hypocrisy of those incoming messages was truly breathtaking. Deacons who regularly ignored the glaring infidelity of their wealthy peers were now lining up to condemn my independence. They wrote passionately about the sacred duty of a daughter, demanding that I immediately honor my parents through financial obedience. One message from a prominent local councilman warned me about the spiritual dangers of holding grudges. They painted my father as a saintly patriarch who was simply trying to save his completely lost child. Winston had clearly deployed every single political and religious favor he had stockpiled over the entire last decade. Then came the masterstroke of psychological manipulation, courtesy of my mother. Vivica posted a highly manipulated, tear-jerking essay on her prominent social media pages. My intelligence team immediately forwarded me the link as I sat quietly in the plush leather seat of my private aircraft. The post was accompanied by a carefully filtered vintage photograph of us together from when I was 10 years old, looking happy and completely docile. Her caption was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood designed entirely to garner absolute public sympathy while painting me as an incredibly cruel and entirely heartless villainous monster just today. "It breaks a mother's heart to see a daughter who lost her way to worldly bitterness," Vivica wrote in her dramatic post. We tried to welcome our sweet Naomi home today to offer her the healing grace of a family reunited. Instead, we were met with shocking hostility and devastating arrogance. Please pray for her confused spirit. We will never stop leaving the porch light on for the beautiful child we once knew. The response was rapid and explosive. Within mere hours, the post garnered thousands of likes and hundreds of comments from the local community expressing their unified outrage. I watched the notification counter climb rapidly on the screen of my device. Every single comment validated my parents while simultaneously crucifying me. People I went to elementary school with were leaving harsh remarks about my supposed ungrateful nature. Wives of local real estate developers sent their deep condolences to Vivica, praising her endless maternal patience. They blindly swallowed the narrative of the flawless Hayes family being victimized by their deeply disturbed youngest child. It was exactly the same insidious script they had used 10 years ago to run me out of town when Simone stole my entire college scholarship. Despite the immense corporate power, I currently wielded a very small hidden part of me, temporarily cracked under the immense pressure. I briefly battled the heavy residual childhood trauma of being the designated family scapegoat. Staring at the horrible barrage of public comments, I felt the psychological weight of the community judgment pressing down on my chest. It is a terrifying, uniquely isolating experience to have hundreds of people confidently declare that you are broken. For a few fleeting moments, I felt like that helpless, scared 18-year-old girl, standing crying in the front row of the crowded sanctuary. The phantom voices of the past whispered that maybe I was truly defective. Maybe my massive financial success was just an angry overcompensation for my inherent lack of worth. Maybe Simone was completely right about me being a lonely, bitter spinster. The toxic poison they had injected into my mind during my formative years was temporarily reactivated by their coordinated public assault. I closed my eyes tightly, leaning my head against the cool window of the jet, trying to steady my rapidly beating heart. The familiar suffocating darkness of self-doubt threatened to pull me under the deep rushing water. Then, the secure satellite phone resting on the console beside me vibrated, breaking the heavy silence of the cabin. The caller ID displayed the encrypted number of Marcus, my lead investigator. I took a deep, sharp breath and picked up the heavy device. The moment I heard his calm, completely objective voice reciting verifiable facts, the swirling emotional vulnerability vanished instantly. It evaporated like morning mist under a blazing sun. The scared little girl was gone, completely replaced by the predatory focus of a venture capitalist who specialized in dismantling corrupt empires. I was back in absolute total control again. Marcus spoke with rapid-fire precision. "We have everything you requested, Naomi," he stated. "The data is completely ready. I have fully compiled the entire financial history of Winston and his commercial real estate firm. The internal ledgers confirm massive ongoing fraud. Julian has been systematically moving enormous amounts of capital into offshore accounts to cover his personal gambling debts. The bridge loan they demanded you sign was simply a desperate illegal attempt to cover the massive shortfall before the upcoming corporate audit exposes their blatant embezzlement. The entire family is currently sitting on a devastatingly fragile house of cards." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression, reflecting perfectly in the jet window. The sheer audacity of their entire operation was almost impressive. They had genuinely believed that public humiliation would force me into total submission. They thought my mother posting a highly manipulated victim narrative online would absolutely compel me to save them from their impending doom. Instead, they had simply provided me with the ultimate perfect justification to burn their carefully constructed empire entirely to the ground. "Send the encrypted files directly to my private server," Marcus, I ordered. "Prepare the legal acquisition team for immediate hostile corporate action. We are not just exposing them anymore. We are taking absolutely everything they own." I ended the call and opened my laptop, retrieving the compiled financial dossiers. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh blue glow as I rapidly reviewed the stolen bank ledgers. Winston had essentially leveraged his entire personal reputation against properties he no longer truly owned. Julian had forged multiple signatures to maintain the outward illusion of extreme wealth. Simone was actively spending thousands of dollars every single week, while their main corporate bank accounts were showing deeply negative balances. They were completely ruined already today. I took a moment to look at the hateful social media post my mother had published. The comments were still flooding in with people passionately agreeing that I was a horrible, selfish child. They believed Vivica was a deeply wounded saint who only wanted her estranged daughter back. The contrast between their public piety and their private financial criminality was absolutely astounding. They had deliberately weaponized the local church congregation to pressure me into saving their rapidly sinking ship. They were utilizing the exact same abusive strategy that had successfully forced me out of Atlanta exactly 10 long years ago. But I was no longer the frightened teenager who walked away with a single $10 bill. I was the chief executive officer of Blackstone Credit, and I held their entire future right in the palm of my hand. I drafted a swift, targeted email to my aggressive legal department, instructing them to instantly purchase the specific debt obligations Winston had recently defaulted on. By acquiring his toxic bridge loans from the original distressed lenders, I would legally become his direct primary creditor. I would own the expansive mortgage on his pristine family home and his precious country club membership. The smear campaign raging on social media was completely irrelevant now. Let Vivica collect her thousands of sympathetic likes. Let Pastor Thomas preach his fiery sermons about my supposed wicked sins. Let Simone and Julian desperately pretend they were living the pinnacle of ultimate Black excellence. None of their loud, performative public outrage could stop the incoming brutal financial reality. The data was ready, and the trap was perfectly set. I took one final look at my mother's dramatic lying post before permanently deleting the application from my phone. The time for feeling any residual family pain was officially over. I stepped out of the tinted town car, walking directly into the glass lobby of the temporary Atlanta office Blackstone Credit had secured for me. The space was located on the top floor of a sleek high-rise in Buckhead, designed for hostile takeovers. Cold steel and polished concrete matched my internal disposition perfectly. Marcus was waiting in the primary conference room. His laptop was connected to the massive digital display screen, taking up the far wall. The screen was illuminated with a complex web of financial flowcharts, bank statements, and wire transfer logs. This was the true face of the Hayes legacy. It was a rotting, hollow house of cards waiting to fall. "Have a seat, Naomi," Marcus said, his voice carrying the steady calm of a seasoned intelligence director. We unpacked the entire structure of Winston's holding company. It is remarkably worse than we projected. I took my place at the head of the long black conference table, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing digital evidence. For over a decade, Julian Vance had been paraded around our community as a legitimate financial genius. He wore bespoke suits, drove imported sports cars, and gave condescending investment advice at church dinners. Simone worshipped him as the ultimate provider. My parents completely entrusted him with the keys to their corporate kingdom. The reality was a pathetic joke. Julian was not a brilliant chief financial officer. He was a severe degenerate gambling addict. Marcus tapped a few keys, and the display shifted to highlight heavily redacted offshore banking accounts. Over the past 4 years, Julian had been systematically draining the operational funds of Winston's commercial real estate company. He utilized a messy web of shell companies and fake vendor invoices to siphon exactly $1.2 million directly out of the corporate escrow accounts. It was sloppy, desperate theft executed by a man who thought his unearned social standing made him completely invisible to auditing procedures. Julian had funneled the embezzled money straight into illegal high-stakes sports betting syndicates and underground casino operations scattered across the seaboard. He gambled away the family legacy on bad horses and terrible hands of cards. The gambling debts were only the first layer of his deception. The display screen updated again, showing a portfolio of luxury apartment leases and credit card statements. He had been quietly maintaining a remarkably lavish lifestyle for a long-term mistress hidden away in a luxury high-rise condominium right here in downtown Atlanta. While Simone was busy polishing her diamond rings and bragging about her faithful husband, at country club luncheons, Julian was spending the family fortune on diamond tennis bracelets and exotic vacations for a 22-year-old aspiring model. Julian was living a dangerous double life. How did Winston not see this happening? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. $1 million does not just vanish from operational accounts without triggering tax alarms. Marcus gave a grim, humorless smile. Oh, Winston saw it perfectly clearly. He discovered the massive embezzlement exactly 3 months ago. The bank flagged a series of highly suspicious wire transfers and notified him directly. Winston had all the necessary proof to send his golden son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. He could have handed Julian over to the authorities, dissolved the marriage, and saved the remaining assets. But Winston Hayes was a man who worshipped his public image far more than he valued the law or basic financial survival. Sending Julian to prison meant public exposure. It meant a humiliating, highly publicized divorce for his favorite golden daughter. It meant answering terrible questions from Pastor Thomas and the deeply judgmental church elders. It meant admitting to the entire affluent Atlanta community that the perfect Hayes family was an absolute fraud. Winston was terrified of the impending scandal ruining his flawless reputation in the church. He was even more terrified of destroying Simone's carefully curated image as the perfect, respectable wife. So instead of calling the police and pressing charges, Winston chose the path of total destructive complicity. He deliberately decided to cover up the massive crime. To keep authorities away and investors pacified, Winston had to immediately replace the stolen capital. But his legitimate credit lines were stretched to their absolute maximum limit. No reputable bank would authorize a massive operational loan without conducting a thorough audit of the compromised escrow accounts. Winston was completely trapped by his own desperate pride. He turned to the dark shadow markets of corporate finance. He took out a toxic, high-interest hard money loan from an unregulated private equity group just to temporarily plug the gaping financial hole Julian had created. The loan terms were predatory garbage designed to trap desperate borrowers in an inescapable cycle of debt. The interest rate was astronomical, and the penalty clauses were draconian. The hard money loan provided just enough liquidity to keep the doors of the real estate firm open and the angry creditors at bay. But it was only a very short-term bandage on a fatal bleeding wound. The toxic loan carried a massive balloon payment clause that was set to trigger in less than 14 days. If Winston could not produce the full principal balance, plus the exorbitant accrued interest by the impending deadline, the private equity group would legally seize all of the firm's remaining commercial properties. They would completely liquidate the entire Hayes family portfolio, leaving Winston and Vivica completely bankrupt and publicly disgraced. The carefully maintained facade of untouchable black excellence was literally weeks away from total catastrophic annihilation. "That is exactly where you come into the picture," Naomi Marcus stated, pointing directly at my financial profile, glowing on the screen. "Winston needs to urgently refinance that toxic hard money loan into a legitimate long-term commercial mortgage before the balloon payment completely destroys him. But his personal credit is absolute garbage now, and the firm is heavily flagged for high risk. He cannot secure traditional funding on his own. He desperately needs a secondary guarantor with immaculate credit, a massive verifiable income, and completely clean personal assets. He needs someone who can instantly legitimize the new loan application and convince the underwriters to approve the rescue funds. He needs his discarded, estranged daughter." The entire brutal picture finally snapped into perfect, crystal-clear focus. The sudden, overwhelming desire for a heartwarming family reunion after 10 years of absolute dead silence was nothing more than a calculated financial ambush. The expensive first-class ticket Julian supposedly bought out of the goodness of his heart. The manipulative voicemails from my mother begging for forgiveness. The country club brunch filled with thinly veiled condescension and desperate religious guilt trips. Every single interaction was a carefully orchestrated theater, production designed solely to trick me into signing away my financial security to save their drowning ship. They did not miss me. They did not want me back in the family. They only wanted my clean credit profile. They were attempting to sacrifice my entire future for the second time in my life. 10 years ago, they threw me out onto the street with nothing but a $10 bill to protect Simone's fake academic reputation. Now they wanted me to assume a massive predatory debt to protect Julian's fake financial genius and Winston's fake religious superiority. The unbelievable audacity of their plan was matched only by their profound, blinding ignorance. They genuinely thought I was still the weak, desperate girl who craved their toxic validation. They assumed I would blindly sign anything they put in front of me just to earn a seat back at their miserable dinner table. I stared at the digital display, feeling a cold, heavy rush of absolute power surging through my veins. The community smear campaign raging on social media suddenly felt incredibly small and completely insignificant. Let Vivica cry her fake tears for her wealthy church friends. Let Winston scream his pathetic threats in the middle of his fancy country club. Their social weapons were completely useless against the devastating financial reality of their situation. I was no longer a victim trapped in their web of psychological abuse. I was the executioner standing at the gates of their crumbling empire. I had all the data. I knew all their dirty secrets. I held the absolute key to their survival. Prepare the acquisition documents. Marcus, I commanded, my voice echoing with lethal, icy authority in the quiet room. I want you to immediately contact the private equity group holding Winston's toxic hard money loan. Blackstone Credit is going to buy that specific debt obligation today in full with cash. I want us to become his primary aggressive creditor by the end of the business day. We are not going to refinance his failing firm. We are going directly for the jugular. When that balloon payment triggers, we are going to legally seize every single asset he owns. The time for hiding in the shadows is over. It is time to show my dear family exactly what happens when you severely underestimate the intelligence of the discarded and completely forgotten youngest daughter you threw away. Marcus did not flinch at the harshness of my command. He simply nodded, his fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard of his laptop as he began executing my direct orders. The digital displays shifted rapidly, opening new secure windows to trace the exact origins of Winston's toxic hard money loan. We needed to identify the precise private equity group holding the paper before we could initiate the aggressive buyout. I paced the length of the expansive conference room, feeling the residual adrenaline of the country club confrontation morphing into a cold, calculated energy. The walls of the temporary Atlanta office were lined with soundproof glass, offering a panoramic view of the sprawling southern city below. Somewhere in that glittering expanse, my father was likely screaming at his panicked lawyers, and my mother was busy refreshing her deceitful social media posts. They were completely oblivious to the financial hurricane currently forming right above their heads. Marcus brought up the original loan agreement, projecting the dense legal text onto the main screen. The lender of record was listed as Apex Capital Solutions, a notoriously aggressive boutique firm known for issuing high-interest loans to desperate commercial clients. They specialized in predatory lending, trapping vulnerable businesses in inescapable debt cycles and seizing their prime real estate when they inevitably defaulted. It was exactly the kind of shady operation Winston would normally condemn in his Sunday sermons. Yet he had willingly crawled into their trap just to maintain his pristine public image. I need you to contact the managing director of Apex Capital Solutions immediately, I told Marcus, pacing back toward the table. Offer them a 20% premium on the principal balance if they transfer the debt to Blackstone Credit today. Make it a cash offer they cannot possibly refuse. I want that loan in our portfolio by midnight. Marcus frowned slightly, his eyes darting rapidly across the glowing screen as he dug deeper into the corporate registry of the lender. Naomi, you might want to look at this, he said, his voice laced with an unusual tone of absolute disbelief. He clicked a few buttons, expanding a detailed corporate ownership flowchart next to the loan document. Apex Capital Solutions is not an independent entity anymore. They were completely absorbed in a massive corporate buyout exactly 3 months ago. I stepped closer to the massive screen, narrowing my eyes at the complex web of subsidiary shell companies and holding groups. Trace the parent company, I demanded. Find out who actually owns the paper. Marcus traced the structural lines upward, navigating through two layers of holding companies before reaching the ultimate corporate parent at the very top of the financial pyramid. The bright white text blazed across the dark screen. The parent company was Blackstone Credit. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second as the massive realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Apex Capital Solutions was one of the 12 distressed regional lending firms my executive board had aggressively acquired during our fourth quarter expansion strategy. We had bought their entire portfolio of commercial debt completely blind, assuming control of hundreds of high-risk loans across the southeastern seaboard. I stared at the high-resolution screen, letting the absolute ultimate irony of the situation fully wash over my mind. I did not need to aggressively buy Winston's toxic loan. I already owned it. The universe had delivered a brilliant masterstroke of poetic justice that no human mind could have possibly orchestrated. Winston Hayes had desperately sought out a shadowy, predatory lender to hide his massive financial failures from his family and his church community. He had willingly signed away his entire commercial real estate empire to save Julian's unearned reputation and to strictly preserve his own fake patriarchal superiority. And the shadowy corporate entity holding the other end of his desperate bargain was none other than the very daughter he had publicly discarded 10 years ago. "I am the primary debt holder," I whispered, the powerful words feeling incredibly heavy on my tongue. "I literally own their survival." Marcus leaned back in his leather executive chair, crossing his arms as a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. "You are the sole managing director of Blackstone Credit, Naomi. You have complete unilateral authority over all subsidiary debt enforcement protocols. You hold the absolute keys to their entire kingdom. If you officially demand the balloon payment, they will have to pay you directly. If they predictably default, you are the one who gets to legally foreclose on every single property in their entire portfolio, including their primary luxury residence." The sheer immense scale of this beautiful revelation was completely intoxicating. My arrogant father had spent the entire morning sitting at his exclusive country club trying to cruelly intimidate me into signing a fraudulent commercial bridge loan so he could pay off a ruthless, faceless creditor. He had viciously threatened to permanently destroy my professional reputation and make me a social pariah in Atlanta if I refused his outrageous demands. He had absolutely no idea that the ruthless corporate creditor he was so deeply terrified of was sitting right across the table from him, sipping sparkling water and watching him sweat. "Pull up the exact terms of the massive balloon payment," I ordered, my voice steadying as the predatory focus intensified. "I need to know our exact strict timeline." Marcus brought the extensive loan terms to the center of the digital display, magnifying the crucial repayment clause. The staggering numbers glared back at us, in stark, unforgiving reality. Winston owed exactly $800,000 in principal, plus a staggering $200,000 in accrued penalty interest. The total sum of $1 million was due in full, via electronic wire transfer in exactly 48 hours. There was absolutely no grace period allowed and no provision for partial payments. 48 hours, I repeated, committing the exact impending deadline to memory. That is this upcoming Saturday evening. I walked over to my leather briefcase, resting on a mahogany side table, and pulled out the embossed cream-colored invitation Vivica had mailed to my Manhattan office weeks ago. The heavy premium cardstock was beautifully decorated with elegant gold foil lettering proudly announcing the highly anticipated community event of the season. It was the official formal invitation to Winston's prestigious Family Dedication Community Award Gala. I closely examined the specific date and time printed on the elegant paper invitation. The extravagant charity gala was scheduled for this exact Saturday evening. The main awards presentation, where Winston was officially slated to receive his prestigious Lifetime Achievement honor in front of the entire Atlanta political and religious elite, would begin at precisely 8 o'clock. The final loan deadline was strictly set for Saturday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The magnificent, perfect symmetry of the timeline was almost too beautiful to comprehend. Winston would spend his entire Saturday desperately, frantically trying to secure a last-minute financial extension from a faceless corporate entity that completely refused to answer his urgent phone calls. He would nervously watch the 5 o'clock deadline pass, knowing his entire financial empire had officially fallen into catastrophic permanent default. And then just 3 short hours later, he would be forced to put on a custom-tailored tuxedo and stand on a brightly lit stage, smiling widely for cameras, and humbly accepting a massive award for dedicated community leadership, while privately knowing he was entirely ruined. He will definitely try to stall the inevitable process, I said, turning back to Marcus. Winston is a masterful psychological manipulator. He will call Apex Capital Solutions directly. He will have Julian draft numerous pathetic letters begging for an emergency 30-day extension. He will eagerly offer them more properties as collateral or promise an even higher penalty interest rate just to somehow magically survive the weekend. Marcus nodded, opening his highly secure internal email client. How do you want to handle the incoming requests, Naomi? The subsidiary managers usually have standard discretion to grant short-term extensions on these specific types of high-risk hard money loans if the desperate borrower demonstrates sufficient good faith. Freeze them, I commanded, my icy tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. Issue a direct, strict corporate directive to the subsidiary management team currently operating at Apex Capital. They are to completely freeze any and all extension requests from Winston Hayes or Julian Vance. They are to immediately deny all financial negotiations. They are strictly forbidden from returning his phone calls or answering any of his frantic emails. I demand total strategic silence. I want Winston to experience the exact same deafening, agonizing silence he gave me for 10 incredibly long years. Set the aggressive foreclosure protocol into motion, keeping my identity completely hidden and perfectly anonymous. Proceed right now. Do you perfectly understand, Marcus? Yes, ma'am, he quickly replied to me. I left the Blackstone temporary office feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. The humid Atlanta air wrapped around me as I stepped into the waiting town car, but the stifling heat could not touch the cold precision dominating my mind. The drive back to the St. Regis Hotel was smooth and uneventful. I watched the familiar city streets blur past the tinted windows. 10 years ago, these same streets represented a terrifying maze of rejection and despair. Every corner, every intersection, every looming skyscraper used to remind me of how small and insignificant I truly was. Today, they were simply the physical coordinates of my impending ultimate victory. I leaned back into the plush leather seating, allowing the deep rhythmic hum of the vehicle to soothe my muscles. I spent the entire ride calculating the precise geometric angles of the trap I had just set. The hostile acquisition of the toxic hard money loan was already fully underway. By the time the sun set over the city skyline, I would legally control every single asset Winston Hayes had ever falsely claimed to own. I instructed my driver to wait near the valet stand and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors into the opulent marble lobby. The hotel was supposed to be a secure, impenetrable fortress. I had specifically chosen this exclusive location for its legendary discretion and highly trained private security staff. It was explicitly designed to keep the loud, chaotic world firmly outside. But wealth and influence often possessed a uniquely insidious skeleton key. As I crossed the expansive lobby heading toward the private elevator banks, a sharp, highly recognizable voice cut straight through the ambient classical music playing softly overhead. Naomi, you wait right there. I stopped immediately, my expensive heels sinking slightly into the thick, decorative rugs. I turned around slowly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid and my facial expression completely blank. Vivica and Simone were marching aggressively across the polished marble floor. Their sharp footsteps echoed loudly, emphasizing their massive sense of unearned entitlement. They had completely bypassed the main security desk, ignoring the strict guest registry protocols. I realized instantly how they managed this massive, deliberate breach. The Hayes name still carried significant weight in certain wealthy social circles, and my mother knew exactly which concierge managers to intimidate and which young security guards to aggressively command. They looked like two perfectly groomed predators, wearing expensive designer dresses and carrying luxury handbags that Julian had undoubtedly purchased with stolen corporate funds. They were hunting me in broad daylight, believing I was still easy prey. Vivica was leading the relentless charge, her face set in a mask of absolute vicious determination. The sweet maternal act she had performed at the country club was completely entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered malice. Simone trailed closely behind her mother, her eyes flashing with a toxic mixture of intense hatred and genuine underlying panic. They closed the physical distance between us, rapidly stopping just exactly 2 feet away from my position. "You really thought you could just ignore us?" Vivica hissed, her voice low and completely venomous. "You thought you could simply walk away from your father and leave us to drown in this massive mess?" I did not respond. I simply stood there, observing the frantic pulsing veins in my mother's neck and the completely desperate energy radiating from her entire body. Vivica reached into her expensive leather handbag and forcefully pulled out a thick envelope. She shoved it aggressively against my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the marble floor. I slowly raised my hand and gripped the heavy paper. It was a premium VIP invitation to the highly anticipated Family Dedication Community Award Gala scheduled for this very upcoming Saturday evening event. "You are going to attend this event," Vivica commanded, her tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "And you are going to walk through those doors carrying the fully signed loan documents. You will guarantee the refinancing of the company, and you will smile for every single camera in that ballroom." I looked down at the golden embossed letters on the invitation and then looked back up at my mother. "And what exactly happens if I simply decline your extremely generous invitation?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any real emotion. Vivica sneered, her face twisting into something truly ugly. "If you do not show up with those signed documents by 7 o'clock on Saturday night, I will personally release a highly detailed handwritten confession to the local press." She reached back into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, flashing it briefly in front of my eyes. "It is a completely comprehensive confession, Naomi. It details exactly how you stole money from our family 10 years ago, and how you returned to Atlanta this week to aggressively extort your dying father. It contains your forged signature perfectly replicated. It outlines a deeply disturbed criminal mind, driven by psychotic greed and overwhelming jealousy. Pastor Thomas has already agreed to verify its absolute authenticity to the local news stations. The entire congregation will publicly back up his statements, providing countless fabricated stories about your terrible youthful behavior. If you refuse to sign the corporate loan papers, we will permanently cement you as a verified convicted criminal in the eyes of the entire world. You will lose your lucrative job in New York. You will lose your pristine professional reputation. You will spend the rest of your miserable life hiding in total, absolute, pathetic shame." Simone stepped forward, her face contorted in a triumphant, vicious sneer. She loved watching our mother deploy these scorched earth tactics. She had personally benefited from them her entire life. "You really think anyone is going to take your side over ours?" Simone mocked, her voice dripping with pure arrogant poison. "Think about it, Naomi. Think about what happened 10 years ago. You stood in front of the entire church and told the absolute truth about me stealing your college scholarship. You had the financial statements, you had the proof. And what exactly happened? Nobody ever believed a single word you said. They looked at you and they saw a liar. They looked at me and they saw a victim. Nothing has changed since that day. We own this city, we dictate the truth. To the incredibly wealthy people in this powerful community, you are nothing but a pathetic, jealous little high school dropout who cowardly ran away because she simply could not handle her own massive failures. We are royalty here, Naomi. We are the mighty Hayes family. You are just a bitter outsider who nobody will ever believe." Her words were meant to completely and totally devastate my spirit. They were explicitly designed to violently rip open the old, deeply buried wounds of my traumatic teenage years. 10 years ago, her cruel taunts would have absolutely crushed my fragile soul. I would have broken down, crying uncontrollably right there in the middle of the crowded hotel lobby, begging them to stop spreading their horrible, malicious lies. I would have felt the burning sting of profound injustice, slowly breaking my heart into a million tiny fractured pieces. I would have done absolutely anything simply to avoid the massive crushing weight of an incredibly unrelenting, vicious public humiliation. But I was not that broken girl anymore. I was the silent, unseen owner of their entire financial survival. I was the apex predator they were blindly mocking. I looked at the VIP invitation resting securely in my hand, feeling the heavy embossed cardstock under my thumb. The crisp edges of the paper felt incredibly insignificant compared to the massive corporate power I wielded. Then I looked at Simone, seeing the absolute sheer terror hiding just behind her arrogant eyes. She was absolutely terrified of losing her stolen luxury lifestyle, her incredibly fancy sports cars, and her hollow country club friendships. I looked at Vivica, seeing a desperate, aging woman who was entirely willing to destroy her own innocent child simply to maintain a completely fraudulent social image. They were pathetic. They were weak. They were already completely ruined, and they simply did not know it yet. I slowly smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, cryptic, deeply dangerous expression that immediately caused my mother's eyes to widen in sudden confusion. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply slipped the golden invitation carefully into my designer coat pocket. "I will be at the gala," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, quiet, dangerous whisper. "And I will bring absolutely everything you deserve." I did not wait for their shocked response or their inevitable angry shouting. I turned my back on them and walked gracefully toward the waiting private elevators, leaving them standing completely frozen and entirely clueless in the middle of the opulent marble lobby. The private elevator doors slid shut, sealing me in a quiet sanctuary of polished mahogany and mirrored glass. The subtle hum of the ascending machinery matched the steady, powerful thrumming of my pulse as I left the deceitful chaos of the lobby far behind. I watched my reflection as the car shot rapidly toward the penthouse suite. My expression was remarkably calm, reflecting none of the violent turmoil hiding underneath. For the past 3 days, I had played the part of the modest, estranged daughter, returning home in unassuming clothes and driving a rented mid-sized sedan. I had deliberately projected an aura of quiet, middle-class survival to keep them comfortable in their arrogant assumptions. They needed to believe I was small, so they would aggressively reveal their true monstrous natures. That carefully orchestrated charade was now officially over. The time for playing defense had completely passed. I stepped out of the elevator and strode directly into my massive temporary penthouse. The sprawling multi-room suite was entirely silent, but that was about to change. I picked up my secure mobile device and initiated a priority encrypted conference call to my primary headquarters in Manhattan. My chief of staff answered on the very first ring, her voice crisp and entirely professional. I gave my orders with absolute rapid-fire precision. I needed my personal styling team flown down to Atlanta immediately. I wanted the complete aesthetic armory delivered straight to the St. Regis. Then I contacted the head of my private security detail, demanding a full physical presence by tomorrow morning. Finally, I connected with Marcus and instructed him to immediately dispatch our two most ruthless senior corporate litigators. I wanted the legal wolves physically present in the room when the final trap was sprung. The private flight from New York takes just under 2 hours. My people move with the terrifying efficiency of a billionaire corporate apparatus. By the time the sun began to rise the following morning, my penthouse had been completely transformed into a highly militarized tactical command center. Marcus arrived first, carrying 2 heavy, locking metallic briefcases. He was flanked by the senior litigators, who wore immaculate dark suits and carried themselves with the cold, calculating demeanor of corporate assassins. We commandeered the massive glass dining table, spreading out the devastating operational documents. The legal trap was completely flawless and entirely inescapable. I sat at the head of the table, a heavy gold fountain pen resting loosely in my right hand. Marcus presented the final foreclosure authorizations. These were the ultimate execution warrants for Winston Hayes and his fraudulent commercial empire. I read over the dense legal terminology, verifying every single punishing clause and absolute deadline. The private equity loan had officially defaulted. The 48-hour grace period had completely expired. I pressed the golden nib of the pen against the thick premium paper. and signed my name with absolute smooth certainty. With that single stroke of ink, I officially seized total legal control of the entire Hayes family real estate portfolio. I owned the commercial office buildings. I owned the luxury investment properties. I legally owned the very roof currently sheltering my utterly oblivious parents. I pushed the signed authorizations across the table to the waiting litigators, who immediately began processing the hostile digital filings. Marcus opened the second metallic briefcase and began extracting the physical evidence we would bring to the gala. We needed high-quality, undeniable hard copies. I watched as the high-speed encrypted printer began churning out stacks of devastating financial ruin. The first set of documents contained Julian Vance and his incredibly massive casino bank statements. The stark black numbers detailed exactly how he had aggressively bled the family company dry, placing massive six-figure bets on college basketball games and illegal offshore poker tournaments. The next stack of papers contained the undeniable embezzlement records. These documents clearly showed the fraudulent corporate wire transfers, completely matching the exact dates of Julian purchasing diamond jewelry and luxury sports cars for his hidden downtown mistress. Finally, the printer spit out the most crucial document of all. It was the heavily embossed legal deed to Winston's primary commercial building, now officially registered entirely under the holding umbrella of Blackstone Credit. I picked up the fresh, warm paper, running my fingers over the official corporate seals. Winston was going to proudly stand on a brightly lit stage tonight, bragging about his legacy, while I held the literal physical proof that he owned absolutely nothing. We placed all the compiled financial evidence into a sleek black leather portfolio. The weapon was fully loaded. As the legal team cleared the dining table, my personal styling team arrived, carrying an array of garment bags and heavy makeup cases. For the past decade, I had dressed entirely for corporate combat in New York, utilizing sharp, structured suits and neutral colors to assert my authority in boardrooms dominated by powerful men. But tonight required a completely different type of psychological warfare. Tonight, I was stepping back into the deeply judgmental, deeply superficial society of affluent Atlanta. I needed to look like a woman who could effortlessly buy and sell every single person in that ballroom. The transformation process took nearly 3 hours. I sat silently in front of the brightly lit vanity mirror, watching my face shift from exhausted stoicism into striking, untouchable power. My makeup artist applied sharp, dramatic contours and a deep, bold lip color that projected absolute lethal confidence. My hairstylist pulled my hair back into a sleek, completely flawless, severe structure that exposed the sharp angles of my cheekbones and commanded instant, total respect. Then came the gown. I stepped into a custom-tailored designer masterpiece that had been specifically flown in from Paris. The fabric was a deep, midnight blue silk that shifted like liquid shadows when I moved. It clung to my frame with architectural precision, projecting immense wealth and total, absolute authority. The silhouette was conservative enough to satisfy the judgmental church elders, but sharp enough to slice through their hypocritical standards. I slipped into a pair of towering black designer stilettos that added 3 inches to my height, ensuring I would physically look down on the people who had once treated me like garbage. My stylist fastened a stunning vintage diamond necklace around my throat. The heavy, glittering stones felt like a suit of diamond armor. I turned to face the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was completely unrecognizable from the terrified teenager who had fled this city in total disgrace. She was a billionaire apex predator. She was the absolute undeniable ruin of the Hayes family. I picked up the sleek black leather portfolio containing the financial death warrants and the highly detailed embezzlement records. I traced the smooth premium leather with my index finger, savoring the tremendous gravity of what this small, sleek object truly represented. The heavy VIP gala invitation rested securely in my evening clutch. The digital clock on the wall indicated it was exactly 7 o'clock. The exact timing was absolutely perfect. The red carpet arrivals would be completely wrapping up, and the main ballroom seating would be in full chaotic swing. Every single prominent member of the city elite would be entirely trapped. I walked out of the penthouse suite, my stilettos clicking sharply against the marble floor. My private security detail fell into perfect formation around me. Four incredibly massive, highly trained men, wearing dark suits and discreet communication earpieces, formed an impenetrable human shield. They had clear, explicit instructions regarding my family members. No one was permitted within arm's reach of me without facing immediate aggressive physical consequence. We moved in total absolute silence, descending through the private elevator shaft directly to the underground secure parking garage. The polished steel doors opened smoothly. A pristine fleet of three identical pitch-black armored SUVs was waiting with their heavy engines idling softly in the cool concrete space. The vehicles were imposing aggressive silent beasts. My lead security director opened the heavy armored door of the center vehicle, holding out a respectful hand. I slid into the luxurious dark leather interior, placing the leather portfolio resting gently on my lap. I smoothed down the perfectly draped silk of my Parisian designer gown. The heavy doors locked simultaneously with a heavy, deeply satisfying, solid thud. We are completely ready to proceed exactly as planned. Naomi, my security director, stated from the front passenger seat, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses. I looked out the tinted window as the massive metal garage doors slowly opened, revealing the dark, humid, sprawling Atlanta evening. Take us directly to the venue, I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of fear or hesitation. The convoy of black SUVs pulled out onto the wide main avenue, moving with smooth, predatory, aggressive grace. We were heading straight toward the most exclusive upscale venue in the entire southern city. The trap was finally fully set. The execution was completely ready. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Heritage Estate was a glittering monument to manufactured prestige and absolute corporate hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the soaring vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the incredibly dense crowd of Southern elites. This was the highly anticipated Family Dedication Community Award Gala, and the massive room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful figures in the city. Wealthy real estate moguls stood in tight circles, swirling premium champagne, while discussing aggressive property acquisitions and lucrative zoning variances. Prominent local politicians wearing perfectly tailored tuxedos and fixed diplomatic smiles aggressively worked the room, shaking hands and securing massive campaign donations. Highly influential megachurch leaders, dressed in custom silk suits, mingled seamlessly with ruthless corporate bankers, blending the lucrative business of salvation with the cold reality of high finance. The entire extravagant event was specifically designed to be the absolute shining pinnacle of the Hayes family legacy. It was a flawless, carefully orchestrated presentation of manufactured black excellence meant to permanently cement their totally fraudulent status as the supreme reigning royalty of the Atlanta social scene. The air was thick with the scent of expensive imported perfumes and the deafening hum of overlapping boastful conversations. Waiters wearing immaculate white gloves weaved expertly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with extravagant caviar appetizers. At the very center of this glittering, chaotic universe, Winston Hayes was happily holding court. He looked the absolute picture of a benevolent, patriarchal leader. He wore a stunning, custom-tailored black velvet tuxedo that perfectly highlighted his commanding physical presence. His booming baritone laugh echoed across the crowded floor as he aggressively shook hands and slapped the backs of wealthy politicians. He was eagerly accepting premature congratulations for his prestigious Lifetime Achievement honor, completely burying the terrifying reality of his massive impending financial ruin under a thick layer of incredible arrogant charm. Standing faithfully by his side, Vivica played the role of the devoted, elegant matriarch with terrifying perfection. She wore a stunning emerald green designer gown, dripping with heavy diamond jewelry that sparkled aggressively under the brilliant chandelier lighting. She nodded gracefully at the endless compliments, her face arranged in a mask of total serene superiority. She believed her brutal ambush in the hotel lobby had successfully secured their survival. She genuinely believed I was currently sitting in a random hotel room, terrified of her fabricated confession letters and preparing to blindly sign over my entire corporate future to save their crumbling empire. Near the main entrance of the grand ballroom, a massive, brightly lit press wall had been specifically erected for the evening. Simone and Julianne were actively posing for a frantic cluster of local society photographers and highly influential digital media bloggers. Simone wore a breathtaking crimson silk dress that flared out beautifully as she shifted her weight for the flashing camera lenses. She tossed her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, flashing a brilliant practiced smile that completely masked her deep, underlying insecurities. Julian stood closely beside her, wrapping a possessive arm around her narrow waist. He wore a sharp, modern tuxedo, but his smile looked slightly strained around the edges. A thin layer of nervous sweat glistened faintly on his forehead. Julian was the only person in their immediate family who fully understood the terrifying reality of his own massive financial crimes. He knew about the offshore poker debts and the massive corporate embezzlement, but tonight he was desperately trying to play the part of the incredibly successful heir apparent. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the grand ballroom smoothly transitioned into a lively, upbeat classical arrangement. The general noise level of the massive crowd was almost deafening, a constant aggressive roar of extreme wealth and unearned privilege. The Hayes family was entirely in their element, entirely oblivious to the massive corporate guillotine hanging directly over their heads. Outside the venue, my fleet of pitch-black armored SUVs rolled smoothly to a complete stop directly in front of the sweeping marble staircase leading to the main entrance. The valet attendants immediately froze, stepping back, as my massive private security detail swarmed the designated drop-off area. My lead security director stepped out of the front passenger seat and opened my heavy armored door. The humid night air instantly washed over me, but I felt entirely cold. I stepped out of the vehicle, my black designer stilettos striking the pristine concrete with a sharp, commanding click. I smoothed the heavy silk of my Parisian midnight blue gown and adjusted the vintage diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. I looked like absolute corporate death. Marcus stepped out of the second vehicle carrying the sleek black leather portfolio. He was flanked tightly by the two ruthless corporate litigators, their faces set in expressions of cold, absolute hostility. We moved as a single, highly coordinated, militarized unit, walking steadily up the wide marble staircase toward the massive carved mahogany doors of the grand ballroom. The venue staff stationed at the front entrance immediately recognized the undeniable aura of immense wealth and aggressive physical threat. The two young attendants, wearing formal white gloves, rushed to pull the incredibly heavy mahogany doors open wide. I stepped past the threshold and walked directly into the glittering grand ballroom. My entrance was completely unannounced, but it absolutely commanded the immediate attention of the entire massive room. My security detail formed a wide, aggressive physical perimeter around me, forcefully pushing through the dense crowd of socialites and politicians. The sudden aggressive movement caused a massive ripple effect across the floor. The incredibly loud, chaotic hum of the gala literally began to die down. It moved like a slow, rolling wave of absolute stunned silence spreading outward from the main entrance and rapidly infecting every single corner of the extensive ballroom. Within seconds, the deafening roar of the elite crowd was reduced to a heavy, suffocating, terrified whisper. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned to stare directly at me. The elite members of Atlanta society were entirely frozen in shock. The aggressive whispering erupted almost immediately, spreading like a wildfire through the wealthy crowd. They were desperately trying to reconcile the pathetic fictional stories they had been fed with the incredibly powerful billionaire currently walking down the center of their exclusive red carpet. "Is that Naomi Hayes, a prominent real estate developer?" whispered loudly, his champagne flute frozen halfway to his mouth. I thought Vivica said she was struggling in New York. Another wealthy socialite hissed, her eyes darting aggressively over my custom designer gown and the massive diamonds resting on my chest. I heard she was a high school dropout who worked as a low-level assistant. "Look at those men in the dark suits surrounding her." A local politician murmured nervously, stepping back to clear a wide path for my security detail. Those are highly specialized corporate fixers. Who exactly is she working for? They simply could not comprehend the massive scale of the power dynamic shifting directly in front of their eyes. I ignored their frantic, terrified whispering. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my facial expression completely devoid of any emotion. I walked with slow, deliberate, measured strides, my stilettos clicking sharply against the polished marble flooring, creating a slow, rhythmic countdown to absolute destruction. Marcus walked closely at my right side, holding the black leather portfolio containing their financial death warrants. The two corporate litigators flanked my left, projecting an aura of completely ruthless legal aggression. We moved relentlessly through the center of the massive room, heading straight toward the brightly lit section where the Hayes family was happily holding court. Winston was delivering a boastful story to a circle of banking executives. He had his back turned, completely unaware of the massive silence overtaking the room. He threw his head back to laugh, but the sound died in his throat as he noticed the terrified expressions of the executives surrounding him. They were staring in absolute shock past his right shoulder. Winston slowly turns around, his diplomatic smile plastered on his face. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, the smile completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of absolute visceral terror. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. Vivica was standing 3 feet away, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. When she saw me walking toward them, her entire body violently flinched. The champagne flute slipped through her trembling fingers, crashing loudly onto the marble floor and shattering into sharp, jagged pieces. She stared at my legal team, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. Across the room, Simone and Julian stopped posing for the cameras. Simone abruptly dropped her hand from his waist, her perfectly practiced smile instantly shattering into an expression of raw, desperate horror as she finally realized that her entirely fake, luxurious lifestyle was absolutely, completely finished forever right here tonight. The collective shock radiating from my family was a palpable electric current buzzing through the humid air of the grand ballroom. The absolute silence of the elite crowd was deafening. Winston recognized the catastrophic danger of this public spectacle instantly. His survival instincts, honed by decades of corporate manipulation and social conditioning, kicked into high overdrive. He snapped his fingers sharply toward the massive venue security guards stationed near the perimeter of the room. The men in uniform moved swiftly, abandoning their posts to aggressively flank my position. They were clearly instructed to intercept me before I could take another step toward the brightly lit press wall, where the local media bloggers were already raising their high-resolution cameras. They needed to hide me immediately. The venue guards stepped forward, but my private security detail simultaneously shifted outward, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits and aggressive physical readiness. The local guards instantly backed down, recognizing they were vastly outmatched by highly trained corporate operatives. Winston gestured frantically toward a set of heavy soundproof double doors located just off the main floor. The venue staff quickly shoved the massive doors open, revealing a private VIP antechamber designed for high-level dignitaries and exclusive corporate guests. The head of Winston's security detail stepped directly into my path, attempting to physically guide me toward the enclosed space to hide the brewing disaster from the flashing cameras. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper that completely froze the burly security guard in his tracks. I did not need to be forced into the private room. This was exactly where I wanted to go. I stepped smoothly toward the antechamber, completely ignoring the frantic whispers of the wealthy socialites parting like the Red Sea around me. Winston, Vivica, Simone, and Julian scrambled desperately behind me, treating the short walk like a frantic evacuation from a burning building. They practically shoved each other through the heavy double doors, sealing the antechamber shut the second my legal team cleared the threshold. The transition from the deafening, chaotic ballroom to the sterile, completely soundproofed luxury of the VIP suite was jarring. The thick velvet walls and heavy carpeting instantly swallowed the ambient noise, leaving only the ragged, desperate breathing of my terrified family. The room was opulent, featuring rich mahogany paneling and plush leather seating arrangements, but it suddenly felt like a highly pressurized interrogation cell. They immediately closed ranks surrounding me in a tight, desperate circle, like a pack of starving wolves cornering their prey. Before Winston could even open his mouth to demand the signed loan documents, a sharp, imperious voice sliced through the heavy tension. The crowd of family members parted slightly, revealing a figure sitting perfectly rigid in a high-backed leather wing chair. It was grandmother Geraldine. She looked exactly as she had 10 years ago, perfectly preserved in her own bitter, toxic entitlement. She wore a severe tailored silver suit, completely draped in authentic pearls and vintage diamonds that she aggressively lorded over the rest of the family. Her face was a terrifying mask of deep, wrinkled cruelty, and her dark eyes burned with an intense, fiery malice specifically reserved for me. Geraldine had always been the absolute, undisputed architect of the Hayes family dysfunction. She was the one who initially taught Winston how to bury his financial failures under the heavy cloak of manufactured social prestige. She was the one who explicitly dictated that I was entirely unworthy of the family name, simply because I refused to conform to her rigid, hypocritical standards. She stood up slowly, gripping her silver-handled cane with bony, trembling fingers. The sheer venom radiating from her small, frail body was physically overwhelming. She hobbled aggressively toward the center of the room, slamming the metal tip of her cane against the hardwood floor to command absolute silence. "Did you bring the papers, you ungrateful wretch?" Geraldine spat, her voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered hatred. She stopped just inches away from my security perimeter, glaring up at me with an expression of pure, toxic revulsion. "I explicitly told Winston not to indulge your pathetic dramatic games. You drag your miserable self back into this city, dripping in some cheap, rented designer dress, trying to make a scene in front of my influential friends. You think you can hold us hostage. Sign them and get out the back door before you embarrass us." The sheer, arrogant audacity of her command hung heavily in the dead silence of the room. A decade ago, her vicious words would have completely shattered my confidence, causing me to shrink back in absolute terror. I would have instantly crumbled under the massive, crushing weight of her matriarchal authority, desperate to simply appease her and escape her wrath. I would have quietly signed away my entire future just to avoid the withering contempt burning in her ancient, calculating eyes. Today, her pathetic insults sounded exactly like the desperate, dying gasps of an irrelevant, decaying empire. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of emotional reaction on my face. I stood perfectly still, letting the deafening silence drag out for 10 agonizing seconds. The entire family held their collective breath, waiting for me to break down or retrieve the life-saving corporate documents they so desperately needed to survive. Instead of reaching into my portfolio, I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the ornate grandfather clock resting against the far mahogany wall. The long brass pendulum swung back and forth with a steady rhythmic tick, marking the final seconds of their completely fraudulent existence. "You have exactly 3 minutes before you are called to the stage, Winston." I stated, my voice radiating a chilling, unwavering calm. The words cut cleanly through the suffocating tension in the room. "The Master of Ceremonies is preparing your grand introduction right now. You are expected to walk out there and gracefully accept your prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award in front of the entire Atlanta political and religious elite." Winston swallowed hard, a thick bead of nervous sweat rolling slowly down the side of his face. He extended his shaking hand toward Marcus, staring desperately at the black leather portfolio. "Just give me the damn documents, Naomi," he pleaded, his deep baritone voice cracking under the immense psychological pressure. "Stop playing these ridiculous games and give me the papers so we can finalize the transfer." I slowly shifted my gaze away from the clock and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. I let the total weight of my presence crush the remaining air out of the room. "I didn't bring the cosign papers," I said, the words dropping into the room like heavy lead weights. The realization hit them like a massive physical blow. The absolute devastating finality of my statement completely shattered their desperate remaining hopes. Vivica let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she stumbled backward against the leather sofa. Simone let out a high-pitched, completely pathetic whimper, clutching Julian's arm in sheer, unadulterated panic. Julian simply closed his eyes, completely resigning himself to the impending catastrophic fallout. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the offshore gambling debts and the massive corporate embezzlement could no longer be hidden behind Winston's commercial collateral. They were completely, entirely exposed. Geraldine gasped, gripping her chest in dramatic, exaggerated shock as the full weight of my refusal registered in her ancient, calculating mind. "You stupid, arrogant little girl!" She shrieked, her voice breaking into a harsh, raspy cough. "You are completely destroying our entire legacy. We will ruin you for this." Winston finally snapped. The polished, benevolent mask he wore for the cameras and the church congregation completely dissolved, revealing the violent, desperate coward hiding underneath. The reality of losing his country club memberships, his luxury real estate, and his precious social standing pushed him completely over the edge of rational thought. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure feral rage. "You ruined us!" he roared, lunging violently forward across the thick carpet. He raised his heavy right hand, pulling it back with the clear, aggressive intent to strike me directly across the face. He wanted to physically beat me into submission, just like he had tried to psychologically beat me into submission 10 years ago. He never even made it halfway. My lead security director moved with terrifying, calculated speed. Before Winston's hand could even begin its downward trajectory, the massive operative stepped seamlessly across my physical perimeter, intercepting the attack with brutal clinical efficiency. The security director grabbed Winston's raised forearm, twisting it sharply backward at a highly unnatural, agonizing angle. The sickening sound of straining tendons and popping cartilage echoed loudly in the small enclosed room. Winston let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream, dropping heavily to his knees on the plush carpet. He clutched his severely twisted arm, his face contorted in excruciating, blinding pain. The perfectly tailored sleeve of his expensive velvet tuxedo stretched awkwardly as the operative pinned him effortlessly to the floor, completely neutralizing the threat without breaking a single drop of sweat. Vivica shrieked, lunging forward, but the other 3 members of my security detail instantly moved, blocking her path with an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. Simone burst into hysterical, uncontrollable sobbing, completely melting down as she watched the mighty, powerful patriarch of the Hayes family, completely subdued and whimpering pathetically on the floor of a VIP hotel suite. The 2 corporate litigators standing directly beside me did not even blink. They merely adjusted their expensive briefcases, completely unfazed by the display of precise physical violence. This was entirely standard operational procedure for dealing with hostile, desperate corporate targets. I looked down at my father, writhing in pain on the floor. The man who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small was now physically kneeling at my feet, completely, entirely broken. The power dynamic had officially permanently shifted. I calmly reached up and adjusted the heavy vintage diamond necklace resting perfectly against my collarbone. I smoothed the pristine silk of my custom-tailored designer gown, ensuring not a single wrinkle marred my flawless presentation. I looked around the room, locking eyes with Vivica, Simone, Julian, and finally the venomous grandmother Geraldine, who was now trembling silently in her chair. I brought something much better. Marcus opened the sleek black leather portfolio resting on the polished mahogany table and extracted a single crisp sheet of premium stationery. It was not a contract for a corporate loan or a deed of collateral transfer. It was a highly detailed, meticulously compiled asset seizure notification, legally authorizing the immediate hostile liquidation of every single commercial entity operating under the Hayes family umbrella. I let the heavy silence stretch, allowing the absolute finality of their destruction to completely suffocate their remaining defiance. Before Winston could even begin to comprehend the devastating legal document resting in front of him, a sharp, enthusiastic knock echoed loudly against the heavy, soundproof double doors. The muffled voice of the chief event coordinator filtered through the thick mahogany, announcing that the master of ceremonies was currently standing at the main podium. It was officially time for the grand presentation. The prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award was completely ready to be presented to the man who now legally owned absolutely nothing. Winston remained kneeling on the plush carpet, clutching his severely twisted arm, while his chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths. Get up! I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute lethal precision. You have a highly anticipated speech to deliver to your devoted followers. My lead security director stepped back, releasing his brutal physical hold on Winston, allowing the broken patriarch to clumsily scramble to his feet. His custom velvet tuxedo was visibly wrinkled, and a thick layer of nervous sweat coated his pale, ashen face. He looked entirely pathetic, completely stripped of his manufactured, arrogant charm. Vivica frantically rushed forward, desperately attempting to smooth the lapels of his jacket, while her own hands shook uncontrollably. The sheer terror in her eyes was incredibly satisfying to witness. She urgently whispered frantic, useless reassurances into his ear, trying to desperately salvage the shattered illusion of their elite status. The heavy double doors swung open, and the bright, blinding lights of the grand ballroom flooded into the dark antechamber. The deafening roar of the elite crowd washed over us, a massive wave of unearned privilege and shallow corporate celebration. Winston stumbled forward, heavily guided by the incredibly anxious event coordinators, who remained entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial ruin standing directly behind them. They ushered him hastily toward the main stage, their clipboards waving frantically as they signaled the lighting technicians. The Master of Ceremonies, a prominent local television anchor with a booming, enthusiastic voice, began reading a highly embellished list of Winston's completely fraudulent philanthropic achievements. The massive crowd erupted into thunderous applause, rising to their feet in a unified standing ovation, honoring a man whose entire legacy was built on vicious lies and aggressive exploitation. I stood completely motionless in the shadows of the antechamber, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold. Winston slowly climbed the carpeted stairs leading to the brightly lit stage. His movements were incredibly rigid, highly unnatural, and completely devoid of his usual commanding patriarchal presence. He gripped the wooden sides of the podium with white-knuckled intensity, leaning his heavy weight against the structure as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing directly onto the polished floor. The brilliant spotlight hit his face, highlighting the heavy beads of sweat rolling steadily down his forehead and soaking into his stiff white collar. He stared blindly out at the massive sea of cheering elites, his eyes darting frantically across the crowded room like a terrified trapped animal desperately searching for an impossible escape route. The thunderous applause gradually died down, replaced by an expectant, deeply respectful silence. Winston leaned heavily into the microphone, his breathing ragged and completely uneven. He pulled a set of neatly typed index cards from his jacket pocket, but his hands were shaking so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly against the sensitive microphone. He cleared his throat, producing a weak, pathetic sound that completely lacked his famous booming authority. "Thank you," he stammered, his voice cracking audibly, echoing across the massive vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom. This incredibly prestigious honor represents a lifelong dedication to the core fundamental pillars of our community. I have always firmly believed that true lasting success must be built upon an unshakable foundation of faith, honesty, and strong family values. The sheer massive hypocrisy of those specific words hanging heavily in the humid air was absolutely staggering. The man actively preaching about faith and honesty was simultaneously drowning in highly illegal offshore gambling debts, while desperately attempting to cover up massive corporate embezzlement. The man lecturing the city elites about strong family values was the exact same monster who had ruthlessly destroyed his own teenage daughter to violently protect his incredibly selfish favored child. He continued to stumble pathetically through the carefully rehearsed speech, his words slurring together as the psychological terror completely consumed his higher cognitive functions. He spoke of community building while actively exploiting the very neighborhoods he claimed to protect. He spoke of generational legacy while holding a legacy built entirely on stolen academic work and vicious financial fraud. I decided the incredibly pathetic charade had gone on long enough. I gave a sharp, subtle nod to my lead security director. It was officially time to execute the final devastating phase of the operation. My massive private security detail instantly formed an aggressive diamond-shaped perimeter around me, completely shielding my movement as I stepped confidently out of the dark antechamber and directly into the brilliant, blinding light of the grand ballroom. We did not walk around the edges of the room. We walked with absolute, undeniable authority directly down the center aisle, splitting the massive crowd of wealthy socialites perfectly in half. My custom midnight blue designer gown shifted like liquid shadows under the massive crystal chandeliers, and my diamond necklace caught the light, sending brilliant, aggressive flashes across the room. The venue's security guard stationed near the front of the stage immediately noticed the highly irregular movement. Two large men wearing formal black suits and discreet earpieces stepped aggressively forward, attempting to physically block the main staircase leading up to the brightly lit podium. They raised their hands, demanding we halt our approach immediately. My corporate fixers did not even break their steady, calculated stride. The two incredibly ruthless litigators stepped smoothly to the side, allowing my massive security operatives to handle the physical obstruction. With terrifying silent efficiency, my men effortlessly neutralized the venue guards, physically lifting them by their lapels and forcefully shoving them aside like completely irrelevant rag dolls. The absolute sheer display of dominant, aggressive power sent a massive shockwave of visible panic rippling rapidly through the front rows of the seated audience. I bypassed the neutralized stage security without a single second of hesitation. I placed my black designer stiletto confidently onto the first carpeted step and began my slow, deliberate ascent toward the brightly lit podium. The collective sharp gasp from the massive crowd was absolutely deafening. Hundreds of wealthy, powerful elites simultaneously sucked in their breath, completely paralyzed by the incredible, scandalous spectacle unfolding live directly in front of their eyes. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the famously disgraced estranged daughter, the rumored mentally unstable failure, smoothly ascended the stage looking like an untouchable billionaire apex predator. The sheer opulence of my presentation completely shattered every single pathetic rumor my mother had carefully planted over the last decade. Winston froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in a pathetic expression of raw, unadulterated horror. His eyes bulged as I stopped directly next to him. He was completely physically trapped, pinned against the heavy wooden podium by the sheer immense weight of his own impending destruction. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. I did not wait for him to recover his pathetic, shattered wits. I reached forward with smooth, undeniable authority and calmly took the microphone right out of his trembling, sweating hand. He relinquished the device without a single ounce of resistance, completely, physically, and mentally broken. I turned away from his pathetic, trembling figure and looked directly out at the silent, packed ballroom. The room was so incredibly quiet, I could clearly hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the expensive watches worn by the banking executives sitting in the very first row. Every single camera lens belonging to the local media bloggers was trained directly on my face. The bright red recording lights blinked aggressively, capturing every single second of the impending catastrophic fallout. I stood perfectly straight, radiating an aura of total, absolute, lethal confidence. 10 years ago, the man standing next to me told this entire community I was a thief. To protect his favorite daughter who had actually stolen my academic work, I announced, my voice carrying incredible, crystal-clear authority, echoing loudly across the massive room. The sheer, blunt, brutal honesty of the first truth hit the audience like a massive physical explosion. A collective murmur of absolute profound shock swept violently through the crowd. The wealthy socialites and prominent politicians turned to stare at each other, completely unable to comprehend the massive scale of the deception they had just been exposed to. The carefully manufactured, completely fraudulent image of the perfect, loving Hayes family was instantly violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In the absolute center of the front row, Vivica leaped aggressively from her seat. Her face was twisted into a hideous mask of pure primal desperation. Her heavy emerald gown swished violently as she pointed a shaking diamond-covered finger directly at the sound booth located at the back of the massive room. "Cut the microphone!" she screamed, her voice completely abandoning its usual cultured, elegant tone turning into a harsh, guttural shriek that echoed terribly over the crowd. "Cut the microphone immediately, turn it off right now." She was completely melting down, losing every single ounce of her manufactured aristocratic dignity. The venue's sound technicians hesitated, completely unsure of how to proceed. Before any of the remaining venue staff could even attempt to physically approach the main stage, my massive private security detail executed a flawless tactical maneuver. The four incredibly intimidating operatives instantly arranged themselves in a tight, impenetrable barricade directly across the bottom of the main staircase, completely sealing off any possible access to the brightly lit platform. They stood with their arms crossed over their broad chests, projecting an aura of lethal, immovable force. The elite crowd was entirely paralyzed, completely trapped in their seats by the sheer massive weight of the scandalous corporate execution unfolding live, directly in front of them. The prominent megachurch leaders clutched their custom-tailored lapels in absolute disbelief, while the wealthy real estate moguls stared in complete shock at the terrifying display of hostile corporate dominance. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The grand ballroom had officially transformed from a glittering celebration of fraudulent excellence into a highly secure execution chamber, and I held the ultimate absolute weapon of their complete destruction. I did not stop to let the audience recover their breath. The absolute paralysis gripping the massive room was the perfect tactical advantage, and I intended to ruthlessly exploit every single second of it. I raised my left hand slightly, giving a sharp, silent signal to the two senior corporate litigators standing at the base of the stage. They moved in perfect synchronization, unlatching their heavy metallic briefcases with a simultaneous sharp click that echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. They began extracting thick premium manila envelopes stamped heavily with the official seal of Blackstone Credit. Without a single word, they stepped directly into the dense crowd of frozen elites, moving with the cold, terrifying efficiency of executioners delivering the final verdict. They bypassed the lower-level guests entirely, heading straight for the exclusive circular tables situated at the very front of the room. These tables were reserved exclusively for the absolute highest echelon of Atlanta society. The litigators began methodically tossing the heavy envelopes onto the white silk tablecloths directly in front of the most prominent megachurch elders, the primary corporate investors, and the key political figures who had foolishly tied their public reputations to Winston's rapidly sinking ship. The wealthy dignitaries stared at the thick envelopes as if they were live explosives. An elderly church bishop with a massive silver cross resting on his chest was the first to finally break the paralysis. His trembling hands tore open the thick paper and he pulled out the undeniable high-resolution copies of the devastating financial records. I watched from the brightly lit stage as his jaw physically dropped open, his eyes scanning the stark black numbers detailing the absolute total ruin of the Hayes family empire. Within seconds, the other prominent figures eagerly ripped open their own envelopes. The incredibly dense silence of the grand ballroom was completely shattered by the sharp, crisp sound of tearing paper, followed instantly by a rising, chaotic chorus of furious, horrified gasps. The prominent local politicians aggressively shoved their chairs back, standing up to furiously distance themselves from the radioactive toxic fallout currently raining down upon their expensive tailored suits. The real estate moguls quickly scanned the undeniable proof of massive corporate fraud, their faces shifting rapidly from absolute shock to pure, unfiltered predatory calculation as they instantly realized the Hayes commercial portfolio was bleeding out completely unprotected. Tonight, this family explicitly gathered you all here to celebrate their supposed financial excellence. I announced, my voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system, slicing cleanly through the rising chaotic panic on the floor. They proudly demanded your blind loyalty, your political endorsements, and your massive financial investments while actively, aggressively bleeding your shared corporate funds entirely dry. I slowly turned my body away from the furious, muttering crowd and locked my eyes directly onto the perfectly polished heir apparent standing frozen near the press wall. My gaze physically pinned Julian to the spot, but true excellence requires actual substance. Yet my perfect golden brother-in-law Julian has absolutely none. He has secretly and systematically embezzled $1.2 million directly from the primary family holding accounts. The massive ballroom erupted into a fresh, violent wave of absolute pandemonium. The sheer staggering amount of the stolen corporate funds sent a massive shockwave of pure visceral outrage ripping violently through the crowd of heavily invested stakeholders. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute lethal clarity of my tone commanded total submission from the room. He did not steal this massive fortune to invest in the community he claimed to love. I continued ruthlessly, driving the final fatal nail directly into his meticulously crafted public image. He actively embezzled $1.2 million to aggressively pay off massive illegal offshore casino debts and to secretly fund a highly expensive luxury downtown apartment for his hidden mistress. The devastating impact of those specific words hit Julian like a massive physical freight train. His entire polished, confident facade instantly completely disintegrated. The sharp, modern tuxedo suddenly looked incredibly foolish on a man who was now officially a publicly exposed corporate criminal facing decades of federal prison time. His knees physically buckled, giving way entirely under the immense crushing weight of the absolute undeniable truth. Julian violently collapsed backward, falling heavily into a gold-gilded banquet chair. He buried his sweating face entirely in his trembling hands, desperately trying to physically hide from the hundreds of flashing camera lenses capturing his complete total ruin. He knew the financial documents currently circulating the room contained the exact matching dates of his fraudulent corporate wire transfers, completely validating my public accusations. Standing directly beside his collapsed, pathetic figure, Simone completely lost her mind. She did not reach out to comfort her ruined husband. She did not express a single ounce of sorrow over the devastating revelation of his long-term romantic betrayal. Simone was entirely purely terrified of the massive, undeniable social death currently swallowing her whole. She let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek of absolute pure horror that cut painfully through the chaotic noise of the room. Her hands flew up to clutch her perfectly styled hair, her sharp manicured nails digging aggressively into her scalp. Her breathtaking crimson silk dress suddenly looked like a pathetic costume. She shrieked again, spinning around frantically, as the local society photographers aggressively pushed forward ruthlessly, documenting her complete hysterical breakdown. Her heavy dramatic makeup began to rapidly smear as she entirely unraveled, terrified only of losing her unearned elite status and her fraudulent social crown. The devastating realization that she would no longer be the undisputed reigning queen of Atlanta society physically broke her completely in half. Winston desperately realized his entire world was burning to ash directly in front of his eyes. The massive panic surging through the ballroom had officially reached a dangerous critical mass. The powerful investors were actively screaming demands for immediate hostile liquidation, and the politicians were frantically rushing toward the exit doors, desperately fleeing the catastrophic public relations nightmare. Winston forcefully shoved himself away from the wooden podium, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of deep purple. He aggressively signaled a terrified audio technician standing near the side stage, violently demanding a backup microphone. The young technician hastily thrust a wireless microphone into his sweaty, trembling hands before sprinting frantically away from the epicenter of the destruction. Winston gripped the plastic handle tightly, his knuckles turning completely white as he raised the device to his mouth. "Lies," he screamed into the backup microphone, his booming baritone voice completely ragged and entirely desperate, echoing violently over the massive, chaotic uproar. "Do not listen to a single word this deranged woman is saying. She is completely insane. She has been entirely mentally unstable for a decade." He aggressively stepped forward, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face, desperately attempting to reclaim his shattered patriarchal authority. "Our family company is entirely solvent. We are stronger than we have ever been. Do not let these incredibly pathetic fabricated documents fool you." He turned his desperate, sweating face out toward the massive crowd of furious, screaming investors, physically leaning over the edge of the brightly lit stage. "We just secured a massive multi-million-dollar capital extension from Blackstone Credit. he roared frantically, utilizing the prestigious corporate name as his absolute final shield. We have the absolute full backing of the most powerful private equity firm in Manhattan. We are completely untouchable. The sheer pathetic desperation in his booming voice caused a brief momentary hesitation to ripple through the chaotic, enraged ballroom. A few of the older church elders paused, looking uncertainly between Winston's furious, sweating face and the highly detailed financial ruin printed in the documents they held tightly in their trembling hands. The politicians froze near the main exits, calculating the political risk of moving too soon. Winston desperately clung to that tiny, fleeting second of doubt, heavily breathing into the microphone, completely convinced he had just successfully wrestled his sinking empire back from the absolute brink of total annihilation. He straightened his ruined posture, puffing out his chest to project the false image of an invincible corporate king. I smiled. It was a slow, cold, completely lethal smile that contained absolutely no joy. It was the smile of an apex predator watching the trap officially spring completely shut on its completely oblivious prey. The entire massive room instantly recognized the absolute dangerous finality of that single expression. The chaotic screaming and furious demanding completely died away, replaced instantly by a suffocating, heavy collective silence. The massive room literally held its collective breath, waiting in absolute terror for the final devastating blow to land. I raised the microphone slowly to my lips, locking my eyes directly onto my father's completely terrified, sweating face. "No, Winston," I stated, my voice dropping. "You did not secure an extension. Your request was completely denied at 5 p.m. Blackstone Credit did not approve your desperate extension because the chief executive officer personally reviewed and entirely denied it." I stepped deliberately closer to my father, letting the brilliant stage spotlights catch the cold edge of my unwavering glare. The backup microphone in his hand emitted a sharp burst of static feedback as his grip suddenly completely loosened. The entire massive grand ballroom was so incredibly silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring wind. I stared directly into the broken, terrified eyes of the man who had discarded me 10 years ago and delivered the ultimate truth. "I denied your extension, Winston. I am the sole founder and the chief executive officer of Blackstone Credit. I actively hold the primary lien on every single commercial asset you currently possess. I own your massive, crushing debt. I own the very foundation of this opulent building we are standing inside right now. And as of exactly 10 minutes ago, you and the entire Hayes family enterprise are completely bankrupt." The plastic microphone slipped completely from his sweating fingers and plummeted toward the stage. It struck the hardwood floor with a deafening thud that echoed like a final gunshot across the massive vaulted room. Winston physically folded completely in half. His knees violently struck the hard stage floor, and his shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible crushing weight had just snapped his spine. The untouchable patriarch of the Hayes family was now reduced to a pathetic, whimpering shell kneeling helplessly in the harsh spotlight. Down in the front row, the absolute destruction of their fraudulent empire hit Vivica with the force of a physical blow. The heavily manicured mask of elite superiority she had worn for decades melted away entirely. She dropped to the carpeted floor, clutching the expensive emerald fabric of her designer gown, and began sobbing uncontrollably. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, desperate wailing of a woman who had just realized her entire identity had been violently ripped away. She reached out desperately toward the neighboring tables, begging for support from the prominent socialites she had courted and manipulated for years. Instead of offering comfort, the wealthy elites recoiled in pure disgust. The powerful church elders, the wealthy developers, and the influential politicians simultaneously stood up and turned their backs on her. They pulled their expensive garments away, refusing to look at the sobbing, ruined woman crying on the floor. The Hayes family was a now highly radioactive waste, and nobody in that grand ballroom wanted to be caught standing anywhere near the devastating fallout. I looked down at the completely shattered man kneeling at my feet. The absolute totality of my victory was undeniable, but there was one final crucial piece of business left to conclude. I calmly opened the gold clasp of my black designer clutch. I bypassed the sleek credit cards, and the heavy diamond accessories reaching deeply into a small zippered compartment reserved for a single incredibly important item. I slowly pulled out a worn, heavily crumpled $10 bill. It was the exact same piece of currency Winston had thrown at my face 10 years ago when he aggressively banished me from my own home. I had kept it every single day, carrying it as a constant burning reminder of my ultimate purpose. I held the faded green paper up under the bright stage lights, letting the entire room clearly see the pathetic, insignificant amount. I smoothly stepped directly in front of his kneeling figure and let my fingers open. The worn bill fluttered slowly downward, dancing lightly through the cold air, before landing softly on the polished stage floor, directly in front of his sweating, tear-stained face. "You threw me out with exactly $10, I stated, my voice resonating with absolute lethal finality. "You told me I was entirely worthless. You told me I was completely ruined. Today I am officially giving you your change. Get out of my building." I did not wait for a response. I did not need to see his pathetic tears or hear his desperate, useless apologies. I turned my back on the broken Hayes Empire without a single backward glance. I walked smoothly toward the edge of the stage, my head held incredibly high, my posture radiating total, absolute victory. My corporate litigators and my massive private security detail instantly formed an impenetrable protective diamond formation around me, seamlessly guiding my path down the main staircase. As I approached the center aisle, the massive sea of stunned, silent elites instantly parted. The incredibly powerful dignitaries, the wealthy socialites, and the influential politicians practically shoved each other out of the way to clear a wide, unobstructed path for me. They lowered their heads in absolute, terrified respect, completely yielding to the undisputed dominant force in the room. I walked straight through the center of the grand ballroom, leaving the burning wreckage of the fraudulent Hayes legacy entirely behind me. The heavy glass doors of the venue swung open automatically, and I stepped smoothly out into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night. The sharp, clean air filled my lungs instantly, washing away the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the grand ballroom. A massive, sleek black Maybach was idling silently at the curb, its headlights cutting cleanly through the dark shadows. My lead security director stepped forward, opening the heavy rear door with crisp, professional efficiency. I slid comfortably into the plush leather seating, allowing the dark-tinted windows to completely shield me from the flashing camera lenses of the pursuing paparazzi. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, completely sealing me inside my own incredibly powerful world. As the massive luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the bright city traffic, I leaned back against the soft leather and took a deep, steadying breath. After 10 long, agonizing years of aggressive, relentless planning and brutal corporate execution, I was finally entirely, completely free.